And hello, I'm a little late, but at least I'm here this week. And I hope you enjoyed, those of you who were watching the rerun of our Beckett piece. And I'm sorry we weren't here live last week, but we've been incredibly busy because among my little notifications for the week, our new season starts rehearsal next Tuesday, so we've been doing an awful lot of preparation. It's As You Like It. And if you are interested at all, hello, James. If you're interested at all, subscription tickets are now on sale. And if you go to the website, you can make a purchase of your subscription ticket. It is phenomenal. I dare I say, ridiculously cheap. I cannot believe these prices. It is so economic to buy a season ticket. And so if you want to buy a subscription, you can do it now. Ordinary tickets are on sale from October the 1st, which is very soon. And on that very topic, we're going to be announcing our Expand the Canon series. This is this new initiative that we're taking to present over the season 6 play readings, properly staged play readings. There'll be lovely evenings under this title, Expand the Canon, where we're going to be much more inclusive in our definition of classic. And if you want to read all about it, by the way, there's a wonderful article in today's, or the current issue of City Paper that explains everything. I'm not going to go into details now. I'll talk about it more next week. But the announcement of that will be on October the 1st, as well as the potential for buying single tickets. The thing about the Expand the Canon is you don't have to buy tickets, but you have to let us know you're coming. And we're going to give priority to our major donors and to subscription ticket buyers, but admission will be free to all of these readings. What else have I got to tell you? Check the website. Basically, all the information is there. We're currently in the process of updating the website. It won't change, the appearance won't change radically, but the efficiency will considerably. And the only other thing to say is, do not be afraid of sending a donation. Every dollar counts, and we are still doing our summer appeal. Even though we're technically in fall, our summer appeal is still running. We're still looking for whatever donations you can consider sending to us. And again, you can check the website, visit the website. There it is on the screen. And as I say, every single dollar counts. And all the donations, every donation goes directly towards the presentation of the show. So when you make a donation, you're helping us put actors on the stage, put designers behind the stage, put all the technicians. That's what is paid for by your donations. And I keep repeating it, every dollar counts. So that brings us up to date. Who else is out there? Hello, David. Lovely sunset in Stratford-upon-Avon. How nice. I love that area. That part of England is so beautiful. Hello, Robert from Shadyside, which is also very beautiful. Hello, Grace from Dublin. I see you were traveling around Ireland, I see on Facebook. Dennis, welcome as usual. All the loyal ones are out there. It's great to see you. And there's Helen. Chilling in more than one sense of the word. It has, the temperature's dropped a lot, hasn't it? Quite cool out there today, but it's still a beautiful day. I was sitting out on my deck having a cup of coffee this morning and thinking, how lovely. Hello, James from Crafton. I bet it's lovely over there too. And Pat and everybody else. I'll say hi to you as we go along. Keep saying hi. I love to hear from you. Now, this week, If You Have Tears is the title. And this is a topic I want to talk about in preparation. As we know, I've been doing this occasional series on the 7 basic plots. And I'll be touching on the basic theme of tragedy. I've talked about it in the past. I'm going to talk about it again in a couple of weeks' time. But before we do that, I want to talk about this essential ability of theatre. And I put it under this sort of generic title of If You Have Tears. What makes us cry in the theatre? Now, the quote If you have tears is a quote from Mark Antony at the beginning of his famous funeral oration over the body of Caesar. If you have tears, prepare to shed them now. It is an incitement to cry. It is asking you to cry. He is planning to work on the emotions of the crowd, but he wants to prepare them to react in the way he hopes they will. So he starts by telling them to prepare to cry. Now, if you listen to any well-written political speech, and remember, it is not the politicians who write them all by themselves. They have a team of people to do it. Because a political speech is not just a chat. A political speech is a construct to get you to think the way the politician wants you to think. And Mark Antony is a consummate politician in that sense. So he begins his speech with this insight, with this please cry. If you have tears, now is the time to release them. Why does he do that? Well, as always, Shakespeare understands human nature. It's the great mark of Shakespeare. It's what sets him apart from so many writers that went before him and indeed came after him. He has a fundamental understanding of human nature. And as I'm always saying, he tends to write characters that are human before anything else. Before they're kings, they are human beings. Before they are princes, they are human beings. Before they are merchants, they are human beings. No matter what their philosophy may be, no matter what their race or culture may be, it is their humanity. And I mean that in the sense of being a human being that comes first. And that's the thing that will affect them as characters as the play progresses. So, with his wonderful understanding of human nature, he creates Mark Antony in a way, or in this particular scene, in this particular speech, one can say that Mark Antony is not only talking to the crowd on stage, he is talking to the audience as well. This, in the hands of Shakespeare, in the hands of good theatre, this is theatrical manipulation at its best. Because as you are watching Mark Antony talking to the crowd, you become the crowd. You start to listen. And he's asking you to cry. Now, crying, the simple act of crying, is a very simple process, which all of us have experienced. I doubt if there's anybody out there, anywhere, who has not experienced the process of crying. Whether they be tears of joy or of grief, we all cry. So, what is it that releases those same tears in the theatre? Because it's still the same process. What makes us cry at a play? How does theatre trick us into crying? So that's what we're going to examine this week. How theatre can play on our emotions and bring us quite literally to tears. The question then begs another. Do we even want to cry? Which is a very good question, because in life, it would strike me that we generally do everything possible not to cry. We resist it and apologize for it. You know, you sort of find yourself saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to tear up. I'm sorry about that. I shouldn't. What is it? So what is it? Why is it that crying seems to me to be something we would resist, that we consider it to be a weakness? And indeed, it is a weakness in one sense, because it is incredibly revealing. More of that in a moment. Crying, we usually associate with sadness, but it's not always the case. We'll cry, not necessarily because of sadness. And just as we, for instance, if you get really sad news, very often your first instinct is to laugh because you go into denial. You know, you hear something really tragic, something really sad, and you would go, no, that's not possible. Your instinct would be to laugh. When you get really great news, such as you look at the ticket and realize you've won the lottery and you're now $500 million richer, you'll start to cry. Why? Why do we do that? What is this? Now, I'm not going to go into fundamental psychology because I'm no expert in the field, even though I often go into things in which I'm no expert. But as I say, everything I tell you may be wrong. The important question here is not necessarily why we do it as human beings, but how do we manipulate it within an audience? Now, the truth is, I don't know, but I have a theory. Why are certain things funny, and why do certain things make us sad? Now, Neil Simon, in his wonderful play, The Sunshine Boys, puts forward that brilliant proposition, which is utterly true. K-words are funny. Cucumber is funny. Kumquat is funny. Tomato is not funny. Why? Why are K-words funny? They always seem to work. It's a human reaction. It's a kind of group reaction we have to K-words, and nobody knows why they're funny, but they are. He understood that as a writer, just like Shakespeare understood human nature. He understood that it was true, but probably not why it was true, and I don't think anybody does know why it was true. I'm sure that people have theories, and I have no doubt somebody today will send me in their theory as to why this happens. But those reactions are predictable. That's why you write K-words to make somebody laugh. The famous one in Noel Coward, it's one of the funniest lines in the play of Private Lives. In the third act, when Elliot decides to get out of the place completely because he's fed up with everybody, and he walks in from a door wearing a hat, coat over his arm, and carrying a suitcase, and Amanda says, "Where are you going?" And he replies, "Canada." And it always gets a laugh. Why? It's a K-word. Cut. Don't ask why. I had no idea. Anyway, to come back to crying. First of all, what actually happens when we cry? Needless to say, I have done my research on the ever-popular Wikipedia, and I have the following quote. What is crying? A salty fluid chock full of protein, water, mucus, and oil is released from the lacrimal gland in the upper outer region of your eye. Now you know. That's what happens when you cry. This fluid, as it goes on, is better known as tears, which then flow down the surface of your eye and across your face. Well, crying is so much more than that, but at least we now know what the physical reality is. Crying is an exposure. And this is why we will resist doing it. When we cry, we're revealing our inner feelings much more honestly than when we laugh. Crying is not simply the opposite of laughing. They are two very different things. We are willing to laugh. And what makes us laugh may be a huge variety of things. And one person's sense of humor may be very different to the next person. What may be funny to one person is not necessarily funny to another. And if you don't believe me, ask anyone who's ever done stand-up comedy, and they can testify to that. That's why stand-up comedy is considered the loneliest form of entertainment, because there is nothing so bad as standing in front of that microphone, trying to be funny, and the audience looking at you as if you disgust them. So laughter is not necessarily a perpetually unique experience, whereas sadness is a much more common emotion. That feeling of sadness we tend to respond to in very similar ways, unlike laughter, which can depend very much on our own tastes, for instance, our own political experience, our own social background, our own cultural background. But sadness is something that we all react to in very, very similar ways. We all share it. No matter at what level, we can easily understand it and we can react to it when we see it. when sadness happens, we know. When something is meant to be funny, we don't necessarily recognize it. There is a commonality about especially the extreme form of sadness, and that is grief. Why? Back to Wikipedia. Grief is the response to loss, particularly the loss of someone or some living thing that has died, to which a bond or affection is formed. It goes on, although conventionally focused on the emotional response to loss, grief has also physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical dimensions. Where the terms are often used interchangeably, bereavement refers to the state of loss, while grief is the reaction to that loss. And that's an important point. Grief is the reaction to the loss. And loss on those levels is something we all experience. The grief of death is one thing that everybody on this planet experiences. And it's not just tied to human death. It can be the death of a pet, as much as it can be to, for many people, the passing of a favored pet and a much loved pet can cause as much grief as the passing of a human being. But there's more. Different kinds of losses can provoke grief, like unemployment, sickness, or the end of a relationship. Grief can be a part of every single process in our lives when it invokes loss. Loss can be categorized either physically, I'm reading again, or abstract. Physical loss is related to something that the individual can touch and measure, such as losing a spouse, where other types of loss are more abstract, relating to personal interactions. Losing friends, the breakup of a friendship can cause grief and cause loss. Now, why am I rabbiting on about all this? Because I want to get the point across that grief is a universal experience, and that matters in the context of theatre. It is something we all share in a very similar fashion. A common emotion we all share at some point in our lives and for pretty much identical reasons. And although grief can be motivated by many different experiences, it will tend to produce very similar responses. And when we see it in others, the effect it has on them, we tend to empathize with. There is a commonality in grief. When you see that degree of sadness in another, it makes you sad. Why? Because we recognize it. Now, remember I said earlier that the emotions of sadness that cause crying tend to make us do everything in our power not to cry, because it exposes us. When we cry, we are given evidence that our own emotions are in turmoil, that our own emotions are affected. When we cry, we're demonstrating something about ourselves that is quite personal and quite private. And it's you. Nobody sort of says, why are you laughing? But you'll always say, why are you crying? And very often the response will be, I don't know, because you're immediately on the defensive. Now, I'm going to use some examples of this that demonstrate theatrically how this works. And I'm going to use Shakespeare because basically that's the way I roll. If I can't find it in Shakespeare, it probably doesn't exist. You can find your own examples in just about every other playwright you care to read, and especially in the great writers of comedy, because comedy involves pain. Nothing is funny unless somebody is in pain. There must be some degree of suffering or misfortune for us to find it funny. It's another one of those strange aspects of the human condition. But grief in Shakespeare is always a deeply personal experience, and one that the audience can share. It's rather like, and I'll be talking about this again in a couple of weeks' time, the difference between what is a disaster and what is a tragedy. If I use a simple example, if an evil monster of a person drives a car off a cliff by accident, that's a disaster. If he survives, that's a tragedy. Tragedy is always much more personal than a major event. A major event can be a disaster. Let's take, for instance, hurricanes hitting Louisiana, hitting New Orleans. Hurricanes repeating themselves on the same date as the last one was a disaster. What happened to the individual people who were trapped, who died, who lost their homes, that is tragedy. Tragedy is much more personal than disaster. We can look at a disaster and go, oh my dear, isn't that terrible? But we see a tragedy and we want to weep. It's personal. So as I say, Shakespeare is all, within Shakespeare, grief, sorrow, sadness is always a deeply personal rather than general experience. And as I say, and what matters mostly, it is an experience that the audience can share. Not because that's happening to them or even has happened to them, but because we recognize the symptoms. We know how it must feel. Because even though we haven't had the same experience, we know the effect it has on our own emotions. So when you see suffering on stage, regardless of the circumstances, you recognize suffering. It finds something inside you that you can empathize with, which of course is the purpose of theatre, to affect our emotions, to make us empathize with the characters on stage. If we don't empathize with them, we're not experiencing the play. If the play isn't touching our emotions, the play is not working. And the play is constructed and performed in such a way that you will experience the emotions, not the events, but the emotions that the characters are experiencing. It'll become real for you in your own personal life. Now, amongst the many rather brilliant plays that Shakespeare wrote, he wrote a rather wonderful trilogy of plays, which are called history plays, because they're based around the Wars of the Roses. It is the trilogy of Henry IV. Now, Henry IV was a very weak king, and historically, he was crowned when he was, I think, like 6 months old in France. That made him a very weak king. Married, produced a son who went on to become the great hero Henry V. But Henry IV himself was weak, and over that period of his reign, others attempted to usurp the throne. So a war was fought between two great noble houses, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and they each wore a different color rose, which was combined together eventually by Henry Tudor to create the Tudor rose. And the red rose and the white basically went to war. So these three plays, and it's a vast subject and a vast theatrical experience, but these three plays are not merely history. They are an examination of pain and suffering and futility. Now, in the third part, the final part of it, there is one of the most remarkable scenes. It's so modern in the sense that it is universal and eternal, because it is a universal and eternal experience of grief. The king is observing a tragic scene, not a disaster, a tragic scene, which is being acted out during a civil war on a battlefield. And the battle which is being fought on the king's behalf to retain his crown is not for the benefit of the soldiers who did the fighting, but purely for the benefit of the king, the weak king. Now, in this scene, he witnesses two encounters. This scene could have been written yesterday. It could have been written during the American Civil War. It could have been written in any civil war. It could be written in Kosovo. It could have been written in Afghanistan. It could be written anywhere where you have civil strife, where you have where families fight against each other. The scene consists of 5 characters: the king, a son who has killed his father, and a father who has killed his son. Now, even just describing that brings forward an emotion. You sort of think, oh God, no, that's awful. Think about it. A son who has killed his own father, a father who has killed his own son. And we feel their grief. Not because we've done the deed, or at least I hope we haven't, but because we can recognize the emotion of losing a child or a parent and losing them for no good reason, because of fate, because of circumstance. And we find a kinship, a recognition of those people. We find ourselves a personal sense of loss and perhaps blame, because at some point in our lives, something similar has happened, even as simple as letting the cat out and having it run over by a truck. Why did I let it out? You feel that sense of blame, that sense of loss. You recognize that something precious to you has died because of your actions or your inactions. So there we are in that scene. And this is the trick of theater. The king is sitting, watching, listening. A son comes on carrying a dead body. And he says, "Who's this? Oh God, it is my father's face, whom in this conflict I unawares have killed. Oh, heavy times begetting such events. From London by the king I was pressed forth. My father, being the Earl of Warwick's man, came on the part of York, pressed by his master. And I, who at his hands received my life, him have by my hands of life bereaved him. Pardon me, O God, I knew not what I did, and pardon, Father, for I knew not thee. My tears shall wipe away these bloody marks, and no more words till they have flowed their fill." And in that brief speech, you see that incredible sense of futility on the part of the character. And if you're human at all, you feel that sense of futility on the part of yourself. The regret, the grief, and the willingness to cry, to expose that grief to yourself, to let it all come out. When the king watches this, knowing that this happened for him, "O precious spectacle, O bloody times, whilst lions war and battle for their dens, poor harmless lambs abide their enmity. Weep, wretched man, I'll aid thee tear for tear, and let our hearts and eyes like civil war be blind with tears, and break o'ercharged with grief." The willingness, when grief is overwhelming, when the circumstance is overwhelming, to release the emotions and cry. And what the theater is doing, what Shakespeare is doing, is saying, you know this. You've been here. You know this feeling. Not necessarily the circumstance, not necessarily the action, but you know this emotion. You share this, recognize it, empathize with the futility of such a loss. And at that moment, when you think things couldn't get any worse, enter a father that has killed his son. And the father says, "But let me see this foeman's face." "Ah, no, 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 it is my only son." Look at that repetition. We'll see that again in a moment. But the use of that repetition is significant. "No, no, no, it is my only son. Ah, boy, if any life be left in thee, throw up thine eye. See, see what showers arise, blown with the windy tempest of my heart upon thy words that kill mine eye and heart. Oh, pity God this miserable age, what stratagems, how fell, how butcherly, erroneous, mutinous, and unnatural this deadly quarrel daily doth beget. O boy, thy father gave thee life too soon, and hath bereft thee of thy life too late. Again, it is that same grief from the reverse position. And look at that. It is what Shakespeare is doing. What we are doing is playing on your own emotions and your own realizations of the stupidity of such waste. That wants to make us weep. Would make the angels weep. Another quote. What stratagems, how fell, how butcherly, erroneous, mutinous, and unnatural this deadly quarrel daily doth beget. This kind of stupidity, and Shakespeare is saying it to the audience, this kind of stupidity, this kind of madness begets this kind of grief daily, where a father can kill his son and a son can kill his own father. And the king still looking on, woe above woe, grief more than common grief. Oh, that my death would stay these rueful deeds. Oh, pity, pity, gentle heaven, pity. Again, the repetitions. The red rose and the white are on his face, the fatal colours of our striving houses. The one his purple blood right well resembles, the other his pale cheeks. And that's a beautiful image. Shakespeare using that image of the red rose and the white to represent the pale skin of death and the redness of the blood. And what he's doing is making us see the scene, but feel the grief. Because if you see something like that, if you see the futility of that loss, you will, if you are human at all, you will find a point of recognition, not in the action, but in the emotion. And here's another example of how the theatre can make us want to cry, willing to cry. Shakespeare's greatest love story is filled with tragedy. And we feel it deeply because we see it unfold with absolute clarity. And I am speaking, which is unquestionably the greatest love story. And it's the greatest love story because it has all the aspects that love can make us suffer. It's not just a romantic, sweet story of two young kids who want to be intimate with one another and get married, and then through the whole circumstances, mistakes get dead. No, this is something much deeper, much more profound. We know, when we watch Othello, we know right throughout the play, almost from the very beginning, that this will not end happily. It is fraught from the very, very beginning. Even the marriage is disapproved of by just about everybody important, especially Desdemona's father. The villain of the play, Iago, even tells us just how badly he's going to behave constantly throughout the play. We are never left in any doubt whatsoever of what is going to happen. We know the inevitable. And more importantly, we are helpless to prevent it. It's watching the accident happen, watching the car crash happen in slow motion and knowing that there is nothing we can do to stop it. We cannot prevent it happening. And we recognize these things within our own experience. We have all, at some point, and if you haven't yet, you will eventually, God help you, we will all watch that car crash in slow motions. And we will want to scream, stop, and we can't. Or we can, but we won't be listened to. When the appalling thing happens, it brings up in us a well of potential grief. It plays on that sense of grief that we can do nothing to prevent it. And what is worse, in this particular play, there are two victims. One of them is killed, and the other is the killer. And yet, with Shakespeare's usual genius, the killer and the killed deserve our sense of grief, our sense of sorrow, our sense of regret, our sense of empathy. The killer himself is in grief even before he does the deed. He has been led to believe erroneously. Look at that word. It was back there in King Henry IV. He has been led erroneously to believe that his wife is unfaithful. He has been given the appearance of evidence that his wife was unfaithful. We watched that scene and know that the evidence given was false. And while watching that scene, we want to say, come out from behind the thing and have a look who he's really talking to. But you can't. It's happening. It's that slow car crash. There's nothing you can do to prevent this. And all the time it's building up within you a sense of, this is going to end badly. This is awful. The grief is welling up within us. When Othello walks into Desdemona's bedroom with a dead absolute certainty that he has to kill her, not wants to kill her, has to kill her. And we want to say, no, you don't. No, you don't. But we can't. It's inevitable. It is the cause, my soul, let me not blame it to you, you chaste stars, it is the cause. Yet I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, and smooth as monumental alabaster. Yet she must die. So you have this wonderful moment of a man looking on his wife, looking at her beauty, looking at what we know is pure innocence, and with an absolute certainty in his soul, she must die, or she'll betray more men. And knowing, realizing, because he's telling us what is about to happen, and we want to scream, no, stop. Our sense of grief at what he is about to do is already welling up inside us. Put out the light, and then put out the light. If I quench thee, speaking of the candle or whatever, thou flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore, should I repent me. But once put out thy light, thou cunningest pattern of excelling nature, I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light resume. He is telling us what he is about to do. He doesn't just do it. He is telling us. He is laying it on with the trowel. This is Shakespeare building up within us this understanding that tragedy is about to happen. And one of the great truths of tragedy is it shouldn't, but it does. And there's nothing we can do to prevent it. When I have plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. It needs must wither. And then, most beautiful thing, I'll smell it on the tree. He leans down. He kisses her. He kisses her. One more, one more. Be thus when thou art dead, and I will kill thee and love thee after. He is so much in love with her, and so much in a sense of his own personal grief, that he is sharing that grief with us, and we are feeling it with him. I must weep, but they are cruel tears. This sorrow's heavenly, it strikes where it doth love. And here is that again, that injunction to himself to cry, to let that grief out, to experience the totality of grief. And as he does it, Shakespeare is telling us this is what you should be doing as well. This is what you should feel. When you make these mistakes, when you get this wrong, you're going to feel you're doing the right thing, but it should make you feel intense grief. Here is a man in grief before he even does the deed that is going to bring him grief. He is feeling in advance that sense of deep tragedy that he is going to be guilty of, that he is going to perpetrate. And we are with him every single moment. The play is playing on us. The play is bringing us with him, making us recognize exactly what he is going through. How? I'll come to that in a moment. Even when Othello challenges Desdemona when she wakes up, with the evidence upon which he is going to kill her, we want to scream out, "You're wrong," but we can't. The scene is inevitable. And we feel the grief of our own inability to change the course of things. Shakespeare recognizes that because that is another human condition. That certain knowledge that there is nothing we can do to change things. and we want to cry. We recognize the moment in our own experiences. Now, not necessarily of murdering a wife or a husband. One hopes you haven't done that and don't plan it. But it's about the inability to stop the inevitable from happening. And that's where Shakespeare is playing on our memories, our emotions, our feelings, because we all know that. We all have those moments in our life when we could say stop and we don't, when we could stop and we didn't. He accuses her about the handkerchief. You gave it to Cassio. No, I didn't. Send for the man and ask him. I didn't do it. And we know she's right. She didn't give it to Cassio. We know because Iago told us how Cassio got it. We know that Othello's behavior is all based on lies, and there's nothing we can do. We are watching the car crash in slow motion, and we know what's going to happen, and our sense of grief, our sense of sorrow building up inside us. And Othello says, confess thee freely of thy sin. You are going to die. You're going to die, so confess. Go with a pure soul. I never did offend you in my life, she says. I never loved Cassio, but with such general warranty of heaven as I might love, I never gave him token. And Othello cannot buy it because he has accepted the lie. And we want to scream, listen to her. By heaven, I saw the handkerchief in his hand. O perjured woman, thou dost stone my heart and makes me call what I intend to do a murder, which I thought a sacrifice. I saw the handkerchief. He found it then. I never gave it him. Send for him hither. Let him confess the truth. And Othello points out, to our regret and Desdemona's, Cassio's already dead. That the disaster of this whole event has turned into personal tragedy on so many levels. Now, of course, Cassio isn't dead, which is another thing. If only Cassio would walk through that door, but he doesn't. He's still busy recovering from the attempt on his own life. The tragedy, the thing that brings grief to our souls, is this wonderful inevitability. And the fact, the one thing that we really want to take Othello by the throat and shake him is, why are you believing Iago? Even one of the last references that Othello makes about Iago, when Emilia says that it is Iago who's done all this and got it all wrong, is Othello's response, Iago, thy husband, my friend, honest Iago. He cannot see it. And the fact, again, Shakespeare using this, that he cannot see it. He cannot see the truth. He cannot admit to himself his own error until it is literally put right in front of his face. Again, that well of grief within us. We want to cry. We want to scream, and we want to hang Iago or do even infinitely worse things to him. But the tragedy of Desdemona's death is so huge because we see how it could have been avoided and could do nothing. And that is something that we recognize within ourselves. How often do we witness such a moment when, no matter how much we tell the truth, we're not believed? That has happened to every one of us. We see Desdemona's dilemma, knowing there's nothing that can be done to fix it, because we know within ourselves, we recognize moments, as I say, when we tell the truth, we tell the truth, we know the truth, and we're not believed. It is an ultimate frustration. It would make you weep. And after the act is done, after he has killed Desdemona, we see that grief in the soul of the perpetrator. My wife, what wife? I have no wife. O insupportable, O heavy hour, methinks it should now be a huge eclipse of sun and moon, and that the affrighted globe should yawn at alteration. That sense of I love that line. My wife, what wife? I have no wife. That moment that occurs when everything changes, the moment of death, when nothing is the same again, nothing can be. And it's not just the death of a person, perhaps, but the death of a situation, a job, a friendship, so many things, but we recognize them. They are in our imagination, they are in our memory, and that's what we are playing on. That's what Shakespeare's playing on. I'll give you one more example. How are we doing? Oh, yeah. To my mind, the greatest moment of pure grief takes place in what, to my mind, is the greatest play ever written. Shakespeare again, of course. And that is King Lear. Here we have a man, a character that we have followed through 5 acts of absolute stupidity. A man who has been wrong about everything. A man who was filled with the arrogance of his own position and authority, the perfect example of hubris. A man coming face to face with his own intractable stupidity, who recognizes finally, by going through what is called madness, but to my mind is startling realization, that he is the cause of his own destruction, that he has done nothing to behave like a king except sit on a throne and give orders. That wonderful speech on the heath, poor naked wretches, wheresoever you are, abide the pelting of this pitiless storm. And he goes on, I have ta'en too little care of this. The realization that he did badly, but the realization comes too late. We know that. We recognize that. It fills us with our own personal sense of grief. And in his dying moments are a brilliant demonstration of the power of pure grief to bring death. And we can recognize this one, the absolute sense of loss. How many of us at certain points in our life when things have gone so far amiss, I just want to die. I just can't go on. I just end it. This is not a wish for suicide. It is a wish to just stop. And that is death by grief. When Lear is surrounded at the end and he's got the body of his daughter Cordelia in his arms, the only child who actually loved him, and the only child at the end that he is capable of loving, the only person, the only thing he is capable of loving, the most precious thing he has, and she's dead. And he says to everybody around him, I might have saved her. Now she's gone forever. Mark that word. She's gone forever. He goes on, Cordelia, stay a little. And he thinks he hears her. What does thou sayest? Her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in woman. But he realizes there's nothing coming from her. She's dead. No, no, no life. Remember that triple no from Henry IV. No, no, no life. It is that repetition that pulses in the brain that reminds us this has happened. This is a justification for pure, unadulterated grief. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? And then that, again, repetition is something we all understand. Once you have experienced grief, once you have known the absolute, irrevocable certainty of loss, thou come no more. Never, 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 never. He says it. Shakespeare repeats it 5 times. Why? Because he wants it to beat in our brains, because we know it, we recognize it. We have been there, and if we haven't been there, we will be. I'm sorry to say, you will be there at some point. The irrevocable, irreplaceable certainty that once the tragedy has happened, it cannot be changed. And that brings forth that well of grief. And he stops. I always feel, I've directed this play twice, and I played the role 3 times. there is this moment at the end, which is a perfect example of death by grief. He dies in a mid-thought. He just stops. Do you see this? Look on her. Look, her lips. Look there. Look there. And he's gone. Grief has stopped him. The inability to go further than absolute grief. One quick story. One occasion when we did Lear, a thought occurred to me which I maintained throughout other interpretations, other productions. Though we were doing a production, and the Cordelia, who was wonderful at being dead, and we got to the moment of no life, and I picked up her hand, her wrist, and let the hand flop. No life. And I thought, oh, that was clever, grand. But after what, I got a letter a few weeks after we finished the run from a woman whose daughter had died, and said that when she watched it, it really she just started to gush tears, because when her daughter had died in hospital, they picked up her hand and it just flopped around. Now, not because I'm particularly clever, I'm not, but it is a reality of how human behavior reflects life. It's not grandiose, it's not huge, it is simple, it is pure, it is about the basic human emotions. And when those emotions become raw, especially grief, deep sadness, we release that which we would normally hide. We show our emotions and we apologize for doing it. I'm sorry, I'm going to tear up. That's human. Shakespeare wants us to focus on the extremity of grief, the irreversibility of grief, the inevitability of grief. That's how we do it in the theatre, or at least that's how we try to do it. Theatre, how do we make you cry? Yes, Macduff, yes, exactly the same. Theatre works by using the memory. Yes, that's exactly the right one. The Macduff, when he talks about his children being dead, all my pretty ones, all of them, what all of, he keeps using that word all. He's imprinting on us this enormous sense of loss. He's building within us a recognition of grief that we can recognize within ourselves. So in theatre, we work by using the memory and the imagination of the audience to bring these reactions to the surface, to awake your memories, our memories, sensations that we generally will bury, not wish to admit to, wish to hide. We do everything in our power not to cry. It's one of the great tricks of theatre, by the way. If you ever have the temptation to cry on stage, the best solution, as I learned from my own mentor many years ago, is to do what humans do, which is to do everything in your power not to cry. Just, I will not cry, because then I know you want to cry, and then I believe you. People who just burst into tears, never believe them. But when the audience cries, they're not crying just for what they see on the stage. They're crying for their own memories, for their own emotions. They're crying for themselves. They are, in fact, reliving their own experience, their own lives. So when we make you cry, we are, as Shakespeare, of course, brilliantly put it, simply holding a mirror up to nature. We are making you cry at your own memories of those emotions that you are watching. And when you see something tragic happen, usually somewhere in your mind is a memory of a similar thing or a similar emotion happening to you. So, if you have tears in the theatre, you're crying for and about yourselves. And that's that for this week. Thank you for joining me. I hope that illuminated something. As I say, it's a difficult topic to discuss, and there are no simple answers to that question. Why do we cry in the theatre? And why do we laugh at K words? I don't know, but that's my theory. That's my belief. For what it's worth, I'm delighted to share it with you. I'm leaving you a little early this week. It makes a change. Finally, I've finally run out of something to say. Next week, I still haven't planned next week's, but it'll be on the emails and on the website. Since we're beginning rehearsals on Tuesday, and my mind is rather occupied with that at the moment. Expand the Canon stage readings will be announced on October the 1st. And as I say, when they come along, there'll be space throughout the season between now and the spring, but they will be free admission. Are there moments in Beckett when an audience would cry? Oh, yes. I think so, but there are more moments when an audience should laugh because of the absurdity of the human condition. Beckett was much more interested in the absurdity rather than the tragedy of the human condition. And in that sense, what is tragic about his characters is their absurdity. As you will see, because the second play of the season in February will be Beckett's Endgame. And I hope when you come to see that, you'll realize just how absurd and funny Beckett could be. But yes, there are moments when an audience should cry, but for themselves, because they recognize the situation. They recognize the futility. They recognize, the end of Act 1 and Act 2 of Waiting for Godot is both a tragic and a very funny moment. Shall we go? Yes, let's go. They do not move. That's true of all of us, really, isn't it? Anyway, I have to stop now. Thank you all for being with me. There'll be information about next week on the website very soon. Do consider a donation. Do, if you're in Pittsburgh, consider a subscription. All the information's on the website. Any questions, any comments, that's the email to send it to, marketing@pigtheatre.org. And I hope to see you all next week. Bye.